Right, I'm Josephine Fellows, and when I joined I was Josephine Pierce. I was 17 and a half. I wanted to go into the Air Force, but I was too young. You had to be 18. That really upset me.
Thank you. Sheila, could you say a few words, please?
My name is Sheila Mary Bundrett, and I was Sheila Smith when I joined the Land Army at the end of the first year of the war. My father wanted me to join the Wrens. He was a naval man, but I thought, no, I'll be much happier in the Land Army.
And last but not least, Nancy, please.
My name is Nancy Clifford. I was Nancy Gower when I joined the Land Army in 1942. I wasn't from a farming family, but I had an aunt who had a farm in East Sussex, and she'd been a land girl in the First World War.
Josephine, how did you come to join the Land Army?
I'd been in London for the year before war broke out, and the day, on a Sunday, when war was announced, my mother rang up and came down from Worcestershire in a little old Ford car to fetch me. We drove back up from London in the dark with the car lights slitted. And on the Monday, she and I went to the Land Army office and enrolled. I think we were one of the first two in Worcester.
Nancy, what did your family think about you joining?
My mother was appalled at me joining the Land Army. She didn't like farms or the smell of manure or anything, but my father, I think he'd wanted to be a farmer and he hated having to be in an office. So he was very sympathetic.
Thank you. I'm going to be putting in a few asides as we go through. The main evening entertainment is by our three ladies here. They are portraying three of the dozen or more Land Army girls that I interviewed 12, 15 years ago. Unfortunately, only one of those 12 or 15 is still with us, so it's important to capture their memories. So they're taking on roles of people who worked in Worcestershire during the Second World War. And it's important to say that the Land Army, really, Second World War Land Army, wasn't a novelty, it wasn't a new thing, because in the First World War we had a Land Army too. It was just a bit later on the scene. It was 1917. We were down to about 3 weeks worth of food in this country due to all the blockades and the difficulties at sea. And the Land Army came into existence rather belatedly. They still managed to enrol 20-odd thousand Land Army girls, so that was quite good going in the couple of years, 3 years of recruitment. They were given a threepence a week return for their work, and it was all rather new. People weren't expecting females to take on the roles they did. It was quite a steep learning curve. One of the Land Army girls from the First World War that I interviewed in the 1980s said to me, "We were the first women to wear trousers, and people used to turn around in the street and say, 'How disgusting.'" So we moved to the Second World War in 1939, and our farming really was in a steeper decline than it was in the First World War. We were importing 70% of what we ate, and so things weren't as good as they could have been. But fortunately, they thought about the idea of the Land Army before war was declared. So in June 1939, they started recruiting. Josephine came in September, and by the end of September, they had 4,000 Land Army girls. That was to rise by the end of the war to 87,000. So a huge, mobile and willing workforce, without which we would have been in pretty dire straits. The Land Army, for the people here who know a little bit about the WI, the Land Army organisation is quite simple because it was modelled on the WI principle. And it helped greatly that Lady Denman, who was the key figure in the WI, was also the same role in the Land Army. So she was able to organise things very successfully. It wasn't a fighting force, it never had guns, weapons. Forget all you see on television and films, they didn't do any fighting as such. And the more important part of the organisation was this county committee, county setup that they had. So the Worcestershire one was very, very strong. Herefordshire likewise, and Warwickshire possibly even more so. They had a chairman, secretary, and there were paid roles, and they had county organisers who covered, in our case, Worcestershire, very successfully. So if you wanted to join, as I'm sure many of you would have done, you would have all been very welcome, as long as you liked the outdoor life and you were fairly fit, physically fit. Oh, and you also had to leave home. So if you imagine that the majority of the population were in places where most farming didn't happen, so home counties, Lancashire, Yorkshire industrial areas, over a third of all the Land Army girls came from those three pockets of land. And so you had to move, which many of them embraced really well and thought that was part of the whole experience. A quote again from the Worcestershire Recruitment Agency, Land Army. They said they had people applying who were clerks and typists, mannequins, seamstresses, hotel receptionists, factory workers, beauty experts, musicians and actresses. I'm sure other people as well, but those are the ones they chose to shout about. So if you wanted to join, you would put in an application, you would have an interview, you could have a second interview if there was something else to discuss, and providing you got over the medical hurdle, you were away, you were accepted. Training. Let's talk a bit about that. And Nancy has got a little something to say on training.
I think farmers' daughters knew what they were doing, and they were much harder workers because they grew up doing it. But if they hadn't trained, girls had to go to a farm college and do a month's training there, or onto a farm that was specifically for training girls. They had to do a month on the farm to see if they liked it, and then they were free to go without anything if they didn't.
Thank you. So basically they could go either to college, which in our case here, we've got one fairly close to us in Avencroft, where they were training large numbers of land girls, and also in Warwickshire too. The various principles of farming, dairying, milking, cheese making on occasions, butter making, tractor work. We often see land girls on tractors because it always looks quite an interesting photo, but they didn't always perch on tractors. They worked with horses, poultry, milking cows, various other exciting exploits. Provided all of this was satisfactory as regards to training, they were then offered a position on a farm, and they could go on and learn a little bit more on the job, as it were. If they were very brave, they could skip all of that college-based stuff and go straight onto the farm. But of course it did depend on which farmer you went to and how much usually he wanted to train you and spend on telling you what was what. 4 weeks would either make or break a land girl, I'm sure, on a farm. So she would decide whether she wanted to stay after the farmer had done his best to train her. And for all of this, what would you get? The burning question. Well, if you were very young, you would be looking at about 22 shillings and sixpence a week. If you were slightly older, the ones who were older over 18s would be looking at around about 28 shillings for a 48-hour week. So not a huge amount. And the twist in the tail is if you were living on the farm, as all of our three girls did, they would have to then give back some of that money. Literally half of the 28 shillings would go back to the farmer or the farmer's wife in recognition of bed and board. So you wouldn't actually take it all home. But think of the perks. I'm trying to sell this as much as I can. You would get all public holidays with pay. A week's holiday per annum, once you'd worked for 6 months. You get Sunday working was a minimal, so only at harvest times. A weekly half day off, quite impressive on a Wednesday, often as not. An occasional long weekend, 1 in 4 would be good, and that was really to take account of the fact that you would be travelling from wherever you originated from, which could be Lancashire for this case, and you would then need a little bit more time to get home. And furthermore, they give you a rail warrant to get home and to get back, so you wouldn't have to pay for the rail fare. So we've got a few people nodding straight away here, saying this is for me. Let's just see what our ladies think of it first. Nancy, how did you get on with the hours?
Well, we worked all hours. We started milking at 6:30 and we finished milking at night at 6:30. And then in between, we'd be working in the fields, hoeing turnips by hand.
Sheila, how did you fare?
In the summer, of course, when we were harvesting and haymaking, I would be working in the evening until 8:30, or it was dark, so I didn't get an awful lot of free time. I usually worked on a Saturday and Sunday too.
Josephine, was it the same for you?
We always got up about 6 o'clock-ish, had a couple of biscuits and a mug of tea, and then worked through all the jobs until they were done.
Nancy, I've mentioned pay. What did you get?
Well, the pay I got was for over 21, so I got 28 shillings and 11 pence. After you paid your landlady for board and lodgings, then you had the rest. I mean, for us, 10 shillings was a lot of money. You could do an enormous amount with it.
Thank you. Now, I mentioned that our 3 ladies, or girls, I will use the term girls, and I hope to explain that out of the people I interviewed, 15 or so, every lady said we were a girl then and we're a girl now, so called us Land Army girls. There's no other way of saying it. And so I'm afraid I stick to that. So our girls all lived on the farms where they worked, and they all had different arrangements. So if you could tell us a little bit about it. Nancy, what were your secrets, please?
The arrangement was that I would live with a friend of the farmer's. She was a tenant who lived in a cottage, and instead of paying rent, she took a land girl. And this must say rather influenced me, because her son was Michael Powell, the film director.
Sheila, anything exciting for your arrangements?
I lived in lodgings with a Mrs. Stubbs. It was near my family home, but although it was not far to go, it was a very big step, as I was an only child and had only just left school. I was 17. I had a bicycle, so that I could cycle home for my lunch each day.
And Josephine, was it the same for you?
Well, I was sent to live on a farm just outside Upton. I was treated very well, really, well fed, but I used to get a bit cold. She was a bit spare with the blankets. And I remember getting a mat out and putting that over me.
So those are 3 glimpses of life on a farm, but the other way of doing things was in a hostel. Hostels were where you grouped, say, 30, 35, could even be more girls together. And they had the benefits of sharing experiences and having a little bit of fun every now and again. There were 700 hostels by the end of the war, so they were quite spread over the country. But the variation is quite amazing. In Scotland they had several castles that they requisitioned, so large stone buildings, plenty of space. 1 or 2 around here were chicken sheds. Nothing more, nothing less than a chicken shed, which the farmer had gone out and whitewashed the day before and put down straw palliasses on the floor, and that was it. So very variable. But a quarter of all the Land Army girls stayed in this sort of accommodation rather than on farms, so there's quite a lot were there. The big plus was they had staff, so you didn't have to come home and worry about cooking. They had cooks, housekeepers, people who could keep the chicken shed clean or the castle clean. And I'm just going to read a very short piece from another lady who's not represented tonight, whose name's Catherine Townsend, who was born and bred in London, and she signed up for 2 years in the Land Army and left Paddington on a very cold November morning, bound for a hostel near Pershore. And she said, "We were welcomed at the hostel by a lady in uniform who told us that she was the gang leader for the work and that Mrs. Cribb was the warden in charge of us all. Our ration books were handed in and we were given a tin mug, a knife, a fork and a spoon. What a day. Rules were there for us to read and of course we had to abide by them. The 10 of us were shown our room. We all became friendly. We knew we had to make the best of it. There was no turning back. I thought if only I could get my ration book and insurance card, I'd be heading for home." But she didn't. She stayed, and in the end, she said, just like all the other land girls that I interviewed, it was the making of her. It was that independence that she got from coming away from home and doing what she did. But I think our girls sometimes have a view on hostel life too. I know Nancy does. What are you going to tell us?
There are a lot of problems, particularly in the hostels, because the hostel girls work for the War Ag and were paid by the War Ag and were contracted out to different farms every day. They were collected in a van or a truck, so they didn't have to worry about their employment at all. But of course there were complaints in the hostels, especially about the food. But their food was good, though they did terribly well for rations.
So really, it depends who you ask what they think is the best way, whether it's on the farm or in the hostel. Both of them, both groups of girls though, were united by several things, and that was the important bit about the Land Army. They wanted to bring everybody together. And what better way than to have a uniform? And we can remember and recall on television and films some of the aspects of the uniform. The hat is possibly the most evocative. I'm really pleased that our local collection at the back has got a hat perched on the board there. They didn't last very long, the moths rather like hats made of felt. So that's good. But the availability of uniforms, if you can imagine rolling out a uniform and distributing it to all the various farms where the land girls were, was a major logistical exercise. So they didn't always get the uniform that they wanted. Josephine, what can you tell us?
No, we didn't. We used to wear a uniform to start with, but they didn't issue any until later on. For the first 12 months, I used to use my own jodhpurs and breeches with other clothes in the winter.
And Nancy, was it the same?
We were supplied with a full uniform, gumboots, dungarees and a milking jacket. I still got the dungarees, they're jolly useful. I think we got one pair of corduroy breeches, a pair of uncomfortable, heavy army boots, a jersey, a couple of shirts, a hat and a grey coat.
Josephine, what were the coats like?
Oh, the coats were lovely, like an army officer's camel hair coats. They were brown, but by golly, they were lovely and warm.
And Sheila, what else did you have?
I had a mac, which obviously one had to wear sometimes. It wasn't a thick mac, a light mac, which you could put on and still work in.
And Nancy, where did you get the clothing from?
They had Land Army shops where you could go and buy second-hand clothing, all second-hand. A lot of girls didn't stay as it was voluntary. Nobody was forced to do it, so their clothes were then sold on.
We've covered a lot of the uniform there. The gumboots, as they called them, were the prized commodity. If you could get your hands on those and keep them, then you were doing exceptionally well as a land girl. I have to say that Nancy mentioned the fact that she's still got her dungarees. When I was interviewing Nancy, she'd moved to Herefordshire, and she was in a little cottage, and she made me a cup of tea and then disappeared for a while after saying what she just said. And she came downstairs and she got the dungarees on. They still fitted absolutely perfectly, modelled them to perfection. So there were all of those various things. The green jerseys, those are another thing that just disappear, I'm afraid, over time. So if you ever do see green jerseys or hats on a certain well-known website, then grab them if you're interested. They also had the armlets, and I think there's one or two of those at the back as well. The armbands, which indicated how long they'd served for, which is quite a status thing for parades and other things that you'll see a bit later. And finally, the metal badge, which is on the hat at the back. That is also quite a common item, but a lovely thing to have. Now, you could always replace those various things that our girls have said. The unfortunate twist in the tale is that you have to use your own clothing coupons, which I think would have been a bit of a difficult balancing decision to make if you were thinking of something for yourself or something for the army uniform. So we've got our girls trained, given a farm and a uniform, and they've now got to start work. And at this time, Second World War, the agricultural labour force was overwhelmingly male. How did they get on? Nancy, can you tell us?
The other farm workers were fine, although they did mock us and stand back as we heaved 100-weight sacks around the place, just to see if we could do it. The men were always very competitive if you were building a haystack or anything. You needed to get as many sheaves as possible on your pitchfork. It was backbreaking, but we did become very strong.
Sheila, tell us a little bit more about your life.
I can remember that the foreman wouldn't tolerate any slacking or saying, I can't do that. He'd say, girl, if you joined the Land Army, you do it. Other than that, I think the rest of the staff accepted me, although they expected me to do exactly the same as they were doing. The fact that I was a girl made no difference.
Josephine, did it make any difference that you were a girl?
Well, I wasn't the only land girl on my farm, but I was the only one for miles around. And they used to come and stare at me over the hedge.
I have to say that the they were males.
Quite enjoyed it, actually.
And right, we're going to then move on quickly from that to the jobs you did on the farm. Let's have a little bit more information on that if we could. Josephine, again, if you could tell us a little bit more about your main job, please.
Well, while I was in Upton, I used to take the milk round the town on a float. My old pony, he knew the round very well, and I'd start off from the farm down a long drive. Then we'd all go all the way around the town. He'd stop at every house. He knew exactly where to stop and wait for me. And I'd jump on the back and say, go on, Charlie. But the first time he got to the end and I didn't tie him up, he galloped back home with the milk float. I had to go into a neighbouring house and ring up the farm. Anyway, he got back, never got stuck in the gateway, and from then on I had to have a halter on him and tie him to the gate at the last house.
Nancy, what were you involved with?
I'd done dairying and could milk, so I went to a farmer who was starting a dairy farm. He had a proper dairy and a sterilising room and brand new milking machines, which of course were just coming in. We had to get our 25 cows used to the milking machines, but it was quite a problem. There was one old girl called Primrose, I presume that was the cow, who would not give her milk to the machine. She just refused. She'd been absolutely busting. Until the end of her days, I would sit down and milk, and the milk would absolutely flow out of her by hand, but she'd never give a drop to the machine.
Josephine, ups and downs in your farming life?
Well, yes, the worst job that I had to do was thistle cutting. I used to have a hook, a long curved thing. I think I did 100 acres and cut every single thistle in all of those pastures.
And Sheila, while we're on the worst jobs, what was yours, please?
My worst job probably was working with the young stock from the dairy herd of red poll cattle. Coping with these, I think, was the worst job. I was really so afraid that they'd get out whilst I was dealing with them. I'd have a cart in there with a horse in it, and it was also a case of keeping the horse from doing anything stupid.
And Nancy, you were dairying as well?
I ran the dairy with another land girl. Never had a man near the place. The sound of a man's voice would make the cattle react. As soon as they heard a man's voice, they would all muck. And we'd have to clean out the bar again. So we never encouraged any men.
Without doubt, most of the ladies I interviewed said it was they were the best years of their lives in the Land Army. And it was an experience they would never ever have missed if they'd known. So they were all pleased that they served. However, there's one slight exception, and I'll tell you a little bit about Ivy while our ladies are recuperating. Ivy came down from Liverpool, Ivy Garner, and she was put to work on a farm in Herefordshire, just over the border. And one day she was driving her Fordson tractor, perfectly legally, pulling a trailer, and around the corner came a lorry on the wrong side of the road. And there was a collision, and she was thrown off the tractor into a field quite a bit lower than the road. And she had substantial injuries. She had a broken pelvis and other problems. And of course she was whisked off to hospital in Llandrindod Wells. So she went a bit further west. She was there for a long time recovering. And anyway, eventually she went back to Liverpool to her parents to recuperate. She'd been told in hospital that really, because of the injuries, she would never have a family, so she was resigned to that. But she wasn't resigned to the fact that the Land Army got in touch with her and said a year later that she had to pay back all of the wages that she'd had in the meantime, and there wasn't even 1 week's sick pay following her incident. So she was very aggrieved, and when I spoke to her, quite a long time afterwards, her annoyance came over loud and clear. However, there's a twist in the tale because the doctors who said that she would never have a family got it completely wrong because she had 5 children. So occasionally you get little blips, but the majority, it was wonderful, it was the life experience they were looking for. A couple of words about the Timber Corps, because that's mentioned as well on the board at the back. The Timber Corps was a small component part of the Land Army, only about 5,000 girls, I say only. And they were geographically probably more in the west, the extreme west in Wales, and also in the East Anglia area. And they were doing pretty much what you can imagine. We needed all the timber we possibly could because we couldn't import it, and so they were harvesting fairly substantial trees, processing it, and then moving on to other forests to do that. The cap badge was the same, bar the fact that instead of a sheaf of corn, it has a fir tree. And if you ever find one of those, you've done exceptionally well, because there weren't that many girls doing that job. So the Timber Corps, I haven't ever interviewed anybody who served in the Timber Corps as well, so that's a bit of a gap. Now, for both the Land Army on the farm and also the Timber Corps, they would also have some time off, not much, but the evenings, occasional weekends. And the girls in the hostels were given a list of suggested evening activities, so they didn't while away their time unprofitably. Things like dances, whist drives, make do and mend, very common, first aid training in case you had an incident on the farm. The one I can never understand are keep fit classes. As if their day job wasn't keeping them pretty fit. They could go for lectures on current events, how the war was going, on health and anything else. The Land Girl magazine, or a good read, if you ever see one, 21,000 were produced at its peak. So there's plenty to do of a very virtuous nature. Let's go see what our girls did. Josephine, how did you get on?
Oh, well, it wasn't a lonely life on the farm, no fear. I used to have quite a few boyfriends. They used to have petrol rationing, but they came and picked me up, and we used to go to Droitwich on a Friday night dance. Brilliant.
Nancy, did you get out and about?
No, we didn't socialise much because there were 6 land girls there altogether, but we were all billeted in different places. You were all farm girls, we weren't hostel girls.
And Josephine, you saw a few things that have obviously stuck in your memory, haven't they?
Oh yes. During the Blitz over Birmingham, we used to go out and stand on this bank at the back of the farm and watch the searchlights following bombers coming up from the Severn from Bristol. You could see them caught miles up in the air. They went up to Birmingham and Coventry, and you could see the flashes. You couldn't hear anything, but you could see the flashes from the Coventry bombing. Night after night we used to go and watch those wretched planes. They used to hum as they went over.
Sheila, did you have problems as well with the aircraft?
We had trouble with German aircraft. They came over the fields where we were working with a machine gun. I can remember the men saying, "Come on girl, get in the ditch." And we used to leave whatever we were doing and dash to the nearest ditch and fall into it, which was not very nice.
But our girls persisted, as did virtually all of the girls who enlisted to join the Land Army. And they survived the war and came out, and I'd like to now ask them what they did at the end of the war, if they could tell us. Nancy, could you start, please?
I carried on in the Land Army until the end of 1946. I didn't carry on farming because I was a frustrated actress and I'd done radio work for Children's Hour before the war. I took a chance and joined an unknown repertory company that was just starting on the Isle of Wight. And there I met my husband and we were married 6 months later.
Sheila, how about you?
I really felt as I was doing something of use while the war was on, which was a great encouragement. And then, as I say, I married my boss. That was the best bit of being a land girl, yes. We were married for 67 years and farmed until 10 or 12 years ago.
Similar for you, Josephine?
Yes, after leaving Mr. Griffiths' farm, I went to another near Severnstoke and returned to work in Upton until 1943. I left the Land Army in 44 when I married a local farmer and began a life as a farmer's wife. We sold the farm in 2002.
So before we see a few pictures which help set the scene a bit, just want to say a few words about what happened at the end of the Land Army, as well as at the end of our careers of the girls we've got here. It wasn't a happy ending, unfortunately. I wish I could say it was, because there was a distinct possibility the Land Army girls wouldn't be recognised in the same way as predominantly it was a male fighting force, so sailors, airmen and soldiers. The Land girls were rather missed out, and this caused a bit of a furore because Lady Denman resigned, which was a great shame. There were strikes, protests, and the Queen intervened. They promised then a benevolent fund for returning land girls who were going back into other occupations, which was a help, so £150 each, but no medals. And although medals aren't everything, they're indicative of a gratitude from the nation to those 87,000 young ladies. And that was the biggest gap of the lot. So they had a release certificate, which was a piece of paper saying you are allowed to go home because you served, etc., but no medal. And would you believe it took until 2008 for the medals to arrive, by which time quite a few of the land girls had passed on. So their families could get the medals, but it wasn't really the same. You should be given the medal pretty much as soon as you finished your bit of service. So that was a bit of an issue. The Land Army did continue though, surprisingly, until 1950. And I met a lady who appeared to me to be quite young in Ulster the other day, and she said, I was desperate to join the Land Army, and I went there, and it was the end of 1950, and they just closed recruitment, and so she missed out. And again, she wasn't going to forget that in a hurry either. So that's a little bit on the Land Army, and I think we ought to all thank our three portrayers. Who've done a great job, because they didn't know anything about it when they turned up. If you wanted to go and sit in the audience, please do, because then you'll be able to see the screen. We'll whisk through these slides reasonably quickly, but if you see something you want to shout out, please do. A comment, question, or any information you've got. This is the aforementioned cap badge that we talked about. So this is the Land Army agricultural one. The fir tree is the one for the timber corps. We talked about education, and this is a typical scene. It's not Avon-Croft. I think this one is in Shropshire, where you can see the instructors certainly pointing to the cow, I hope, anyway, cows. And he's got quite an audience there of Land Army girls in uniform as well, all in the costume they were given. Every now and again they took a whole series of photographs aimed at recruitment. So they were always keen on getting more people to join, which is a really good way of bolstering numbers. And this one was just one of those photographs. And the caption underneath, this lady was a titled lady called Lady Tottenham. And the caption was, if Lady Tottenham can sex chicks, so can you. And they're day-old chicks, which, as you might know, are quite difficult to tell boys from girls. Just to recap on the uniform, we've got a fair few of the bits and pieces there. And we talked about the Macintosh and the overcoat. They could keep the overcoat at the end of the war, but they have to dye it blue. Never understood why. Obviously to differentiate it from other army material. And the gumboots. There was a song, which I'm not suggesting we sing. It was again designed to get that feeling of being united, even though you were actually dispersed throughout the whole of the country, Scotland, Wales as well. So you were trying to get these common themes going for all the girls. This is a publicity photograph, I think, because this is showing a hostel, a rather nice hostel, with a carpet. Although the two ladies at the back look as though they feel it's quite cold because they've got their overcoats on. But they're showing all the various things that the girls can get up to. It's that sort of indicating all the activities that are permissible and encouraged. But this is the sort of work that is often portrayed, and a very valuable work they did too. This is a Fordson tractor, and if you look at the rear wheels, it's got what we call spade lugs. It hasn't got rubber tyres. So on hard ground, every time you're going forwards, you're going bump, bump, and you would find it quite uncomfortable. And they all had to maintain these bits of kit as well. The tractor is bad enough, but the reaper binder behind it are notoriously fickle things. But they had to repair them if they went wrong in the field, because there'd be nobody else there, no mechanic standing in the hedgerow waiting. This was given to me by one of the ladies, and I said, well, what's happening here? Why are you all on the rather good tractor, actually? It's a Caterpillar. And they said, oh, we weren't doing anything important, we were just going down to the pub. Which rather undermined it all. This is Josephine and Charlie, the horse. And Josephine, when I interviewed her, still had beautiful blonde hair. And you can understand why all of the male fraternity of Upton would lean on the gates and watch her. And Josephine again, sorry it's not quite so sharp here, one of her other roles was to ferry prisoners of war they're Italians, I think, and they were kept in a facility near Worcester. And every morning she had to drive the vehicle up the A449, which wasn't anything like it is now, and drop off Italians on the many market gardens that were on either side of the road. And at night time she would pick them up from the same spots. And she said never once were they not there. They were so grateful that they could get this sort of treatment from us as occupation and good food as well. And usually good driving, she said. But it wasn't all fun, it wasn't all driving tractors and vans, it was hard work. This is fairly close to Bromsgrove, this little sequence of slides there were. And again, they use them for publicity, hedge laying, difficult, hard work for anybody, and the girls are making a very fair job of it. Even more severe and even more taxing, digging out drains, no JCBs, no help from mechanisation. It was all spade and digging. I was given this photograph by the little chap who was then an elderly man. He was very proud of his photograph. Henry Hand, his name is, and he worshipped this land girl. He followed her around every day and did exactly what she was doing in miniature. But that's just a little indication as well of how having a Land Army girl living in often changed the chemistry of this smaller family farm, and it's certainly for the better with that one. Timber core, by no means light pieces of timber there. They're fairly substantial and being moved amazingly by the lady on the left, who must have a fair amount of stamina to be able to do that. Josephine again, she kept a really good archive of photographs, and this is down in Worcester. Lady Denman is on the right hand side, presenting her with a certificate for butter making. Her butter must have been particularly good, and she's in the centre in the apron. And there we have her again. She obviously won lots of prizes, and she's modelling the breeches that are so characterful, corduroy, wearing those. And does anyone recognise our gentleman on the left? 3 times Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, who's again rewarding for hard labour. There were plenty of parades. It's Worcester, in the centre of town. They're being inspected by royalty. Everybody are looking very smart, very polished shoes. And Josephine was invited to the palace. The Queen invited her in 1943. She went and she enjoyed it, but apparently a bomb had just fallen through the palace on the night before. It was an exploded bomb which had gone through into the library. And they're all more fascinated by this bomb than they seem to have been by the tea. And we mentioned the release certificate in lieu of medal, and this is a copy of one. This is a relation of Josephine's, and really it's good to have, but it's not quite the same, is it? Thank you. Those are a few pictures to help set the scene. If there's any comments, questions, or additional information, I'd be ever so pleased to hear. Thank you.